And they'll tell you very clearly and very quickly. They'll say, it's that bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. It's called the Department of Education. When I chaired the Oversight Committee on the Education and Workforce Committee and had the opportunity to have oversight over the Department of Education, I always had a great time. Me and a colleague, we would walk over to the Department of Education, and we would just walk in, and we'd walk into some offices, and people would look at us and say, who are you? And we'd say, well, I'm Congressman Hoekstra, and this is Congressman Schaefer, and, you know, we're here to help. And to help, we'd really have to understand what you do and how you help my kids in my local schools. And so you kind of say, you know, this is my congressional district, and here's Ludington, Michigan, and, you know, I'm very concerned about what's happening with the schools in Detroit, and, you know, there's some rural school districts up here, but, you know, this is my congressional district. Can you tell me if there's anybody from Ludington, Michigan that works here in the Department of Education who might understand the needs of Ludington, Michigan? What about Pentwater? What about Muskegon? What about Holland? What about Zeeland? What about Jenison? Couldn't find anybody from West Michigan at the Department of Education. And then, you know, you'd say, well, you know, if we really don't have anybody there from West Michigan, it was hard to find people from Michigan, you know, as we went through. You'd say, I wonder, do you guys know where these towns are? And do you know the differences in the needs of the schools in Ludington versus the kids and the challenges and the opportunities that we have in Baldwin or Cadillac or Sparta? Do you understand that? And, you know, these are just names to them. They're you know, they're just little push pins on a map to these folks. They don't know the differences and the unique characteristics of each of these communities. Then you'd ask them and say, you know, all of my school districts and the state, they prepare a mountain of paperwork that they send to this place in Washington, to the Department of Education. Can you tell me where this paperwork comes in and to what office it goes to? It's kind of like, well, you know, not really. Who reads this stuff? And does anybody ever read it and then send a letter back to the kids at Muskegon Heights or the superintendent at Muskegon Heights and say, you know, we've read your material, we've analyzed it, here's some ideas as to how you may improve your schools? At the same time that these folks in Washington really don't understand the kids or the communities that they're managing, they have a tremendous amount of control over what goes on in these schools. And how do you know? Every year now, what does this Department of Education in conjunction or mandated through the states do? Think about it. You've got a Department of Education here in Washington that is dictating the standards, that identifies whether your school is a good school, and they don't call it a not-so-good school or a school in need of improvement. What do they call it? They call it a failing school. You got the Department of Education telling you whether your school is a good school or a failing school. They'll tell you the same thing about your teachers. You know, we put in all kinds of mandates, and I spent a lot of time going through these schools and talking to these different classrooms. And after we passed No Child Left Behind, you know, I'd started going into school. I'd started going back to some of the schools that I'd been at, and, you know, they'd bring in the kids, and the government teacher would come in, and it's kind of like, well, what happened to Mr. Smith? Well, Mr. Smith wasn't a highly qualified teacher. He didn't meet the requirements that some bureaucrat in Washington said you needed to have to teach government under No Child Left Behind. So he retired, or he or she, they're not teaching government anymore. And it's like, wow. I know that, you know, I didn't know that they didn't have necessarily all the class background. You know, they've got a teaching degree and all of those types of things, but this person really, when I've been there before, they appeared to have a genuine passion for the kids. They understood the subject matter. They must have found out about it some way, and they appeared to be doing a really good job with the kids when I was there. But now what you find out is that because they maybe didn't check every box on a form that came out of Washington, D.C., they no longer could teach the subject that they'd loved and perhaps they taught for 10 or 15 years. Control came to Washington, D.C., and parents and local school boards lost the freedom to run their schools the way that they felt was most appropriate for their kids and would give them the best learning. And we now have a school system that across the United States is getting to look a lot more bureaucratic rather than innovating and being creative as we're moving forward. I'll give you another example as to where states lose freedom. Think about it. Every time you go to your local gas pump, a good portion, or 10, 15% of the price of the gas, that 10 to 15% of the price that you pay comes to Washington, D.C. In the history of the transportation bill, a state like Michigan has gotten, historically, we've gotten 83 cents on the dollar back. So for every dollar that we send to Washington, D.C. under the Highway Trust Fund, we've gotten 83 cents back. That's not a very good return. It's maybe one of the reasons we don't have the greatest roads. There are other people around the country who ought to be thanking Michigan because Michigan dollars are paving their roads. But the interesting thing is when this money comes back, when the money comes back to Michigan, it comes back with a lot of strings and mandates attached to it, saying, you're going to build these signs that may be expensive, but, in the northern part of my district a few years ago, they were going to build a turtle fence along the expressway that goes through a wetlands area. It's maybe a mile, mile and a half long. And we found out about it and said, no, we're not going to build a turtle fence. And so we were effective in delaying the building of that turtle fence for about a year. Came back year and a half later and saw that there was construction going on along the road there, and it's kind of like, man, they are going to build this turtle fence. And for those people who don't know what a turtle fence is, you don't need to have much imagination. A turtle fence is a fence that you put alongside the highway to make sure that turtles don't cross the road. And that's really good for the turtles, except when you build the turtle fence and you prevent and you build it and you build the fence along the river so a turtle can't sneak into the river, swim under the bridge and then get into the median by getting up on the bank there. They put the turtle fence there so all they can do is get in the river, swim under both bridges, and then get up on the other side on the other fence. For the turtles that are outside of the fence, they are really thrilled by this fence because they can't get hit by a car again. But I have gotten a significant number of complaints. The turtles inside of the fence are really unhappy because the only place that they can hang out is in the median or on the roadway, and they can't get back to the road. But the bottom line here is I talked with the governor about this, and she said, Pete, let's not get into the argument about the turtle fence. I'm just telling you that the federal government, that money came in a funnel. We had to use it for road beautification or enhancement projects, meaning we had to build things like turtle fences. Well, for those of us that live in the state of Michigan, we've got a lot of potholes, and a turtle fence is not a priority for us. But it was $318,000 for the turtle fence, and before that we had spent about $80,000 to $90,000, I believe, doing a study as to whether a turtle fence was absolutely essential. In Florida, they've actually done us one better. They've not only built the turtle fence, but they've also built turtle tunnels. So that they now have tunnels under the roadway so that the tunnels can go and get from one side of the road to the other side of the road, and they go through tunnels. I'm not sure whether they've built turtle tunnels as well as alligator tunnels because you really don't want both of them in the same tunnel. That, again, is a bad place for the turtles to be. But so in Michigan, we've been forced to spend about $400,000 on a turtle fence.